I probably won't like the video. All right. What's Kathy saying?
Oh, should I use your screen or mine?
Use yours because yours will be the ones that.
Okay,
Because
can I
it's a-
put it up here?
Yeah, yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to sing. Oh, we're not recording yet, are we? Yes. Can we cut that bit off? Hi, everyone. Welcome back to those who were at the TSANZ recently. And thank you to everyone who stayed behind and kept hold of the fort. So straight back, and I'm going to do another presentation. And this time it's about writing for publication. So what I'm going to talk about is a couple of things. Starting from the very early stages of thinking about writing for publications, and even like how you choose the journal, and right through to then how you put your paper together. Okay, so I'll start with just the first thing about what should you publish. I'm gonna talk about this more so from a university perspective than from an academic clinician researcher perspective, because there are a number of different things that we can be publishing, starting with journal articles, and that's the thing that most of us aspire to do, and that can be in the form of primary data papers, but there's also reviews, letters to the evidence synthesis and systematic reviews, etc., opinion pieces. So a lot of things fall under that. I'm just going to check and see if you can hear me online.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. And then you've got your books and your monographs and things like that. Chapters of edited books, textbooks and referee and textbooks. But the ones that have the most standing are those that are referee publications in high quality journals, of course. And now the government actually categorises publications into these Herd C publications. I think it stands for higher education research, data collection or something like that. And the reason that this is important from a university perspective is because they'll want to be encouraging you to publish C1 articles in scholarly referee journals, is because the funding for the research infrastructure block grants that comes from the university is based on these Herd C publications. So they'll get more money if there's C1 publications than say E1, which are conference publications or published abstracts and things like that. The other thing to think about is the quality of the journal in which you publish. So you will have heard a lot more about this over the last couple of years, because the university is kind of promoting publication in Q1 journals. They have these funding initiatives where they'll only provide funding if the paper is published in a Q1 journal. So that's what we want to aim for. If you look at the university's overall ranking, it's in the 60s in terms of what the university's publishing in Q1 journals, 50 to 60% or something. So it's lower than you might expect. If you looked at my teams last year, we were at 90 or 100% or something. So that's what you've got to got to think about when you're choosing your journals is to get it in the Q1 journals. How do we find out what's Q1? You might all know, but I'll show you in a minute. You might also look at the journal's impact factor, but you might have a journal of an impact factor of 5, but it might be a Q2 journal. So you have to look at both things. ERJ Open is a good example of that. So ERJ Open until recently was a Q2 journal, but I think their impact factor is 4.8. This year, I think it's popped into the Q1 journal. So that's really good for us because we often publish in that journal. You want to know if it's indexed, and you want to know the quality of the journal. So you can actually go to a couple of websites on the university and the library to check what the JCI ranking is, and what you can then look at the Chimago ranking, and you don't need to log into that one. It's freely available. But you can do JCI via the library. I'll put the link in a minute. But if I just go to the library, look at A to Z of databases, and then go down to Journal Citation Index, you can then find what the ranking is, and they have a lot of information in there for you. You want to determine what the focus of your paper is, because I think at the university saying we've got to publish Q1 papers and things like that, it's fair enough. We need to also think about, well, what are we trying to publish here and why? So we want to publish new knowledge, which is really important. But our research not only wants to stop there, we want to ensure that it's communicated through multiple channels. So we might often publish a paper in a GP journal, like Australian Doctor or Medical Doctor, which are not Q1, but it's important that actually a summary of literature goes into that, so that we can make sure that we're actually contributing to the translation of new knowledge into practice, into that front line where people are seeing the patients. So I think that's really important too. So, having 100% is not necessarily a good thing, because if we're doing research for the purpose of improving patient outcomes, we have to make sure the people that are treating the patients have access to this knowledge. So, we need to then look at kind of the clinical journals that are more likely to reach frontline clinicians. And to do this, we need to check the aims and the scope of a range of journals to see if it would fit. And now for review articles, and I learnt at TSANZ, even for primary data papers, ask the editor. So I chaired and had some Zoom meetings recently with the editor-in-chief of Lancet Respiratory Medicine. And she actually said, if you've got a paper that you think might fit, just email her the abstract and a summary of the paper and ask whether or not she thinks it would be a good fit in Lancet Respiratory Medicine. And she'll tell you, and if she thinks it might fit better in their family of 23 other journals, she'll actually send it on to that editor as well. So checking with the editor, particularly around commentaries and things like respiratory medicine, and also primary data papers. She, just as an aside, she said the types of things they like in Lancet Respiratory Medicine, given it's, a journal that we all aspire to, is clinical research, research that will change practice. And they like clinical trials. They'd be interested in negative trials if there's a clinical message to that. For cohort studies or, new diagnostic tests and things like that, they always going to want a validation cohort and things. So that's just a bit of insight from talking with her. Yeah, so here the websites are. Shimago, you can just Google, but the JCI, you have to go in via the university, and I've explained the process for going in there. Rather than taking the link down, you're probably much easier just to go onto the library and find it. Now, you also want to think about, well, who do you want to read your paper? And this applies for when you're writing grants as well. Who's going to be on that review panel? So you can actually ensure that you're writing your paper or you're writing your grant according to your audience. So is it, are you writing for a nursing journal? Are you writing for a general medical journal? Is it a physiotherapy journal? And we learned recently, if you submit to a physiotherapy journal, then they don't like you to have p-values. They don't like inference testing. So they have, some guidelines on their website to say, don't submit kind of papers with p-values and things like that. So yeah, you need to know what they want from the research that they're publishing. So work this out early, try and do that. I mean, often we'll write a paper and then we'll say, oh, where will we go? And sometimes, it's not till you write the paper, you actually think, okay, this would be good for, but also I think it's worthwhile thinking about it from the start, choosing your journals, or at least your top few journals that you want to see it in, and developing the manuscript for a target audience. And I think, often you hear people saying, well, so what in terms of the research? You've got to have a clinically important message. You've got to know what that so what is. But you might also look at it and think, how would I read this paper? If I was kind of sitting down to do a literature search, is this something I would read? So, and if you're not going to read it, then the journal editors aren't going to be interested. So it's kind of a good calibration test, I think. All right. I just want to say a word on authorship because it's important. Now, authorship needs to be based on a couple of things: substantial input in conceiving the study, generating the data, interpreting the data, writing the paper, final approval. You don't have to have done all of those things, but you really need to have kind of met the criteria of at least one of those things. And this comes from the International Committee of Journal Editors in terms of, what meets the author guidelines for being an author on a paper. So really think about this, I think, in terms of writing your paper. Make sure that everyone that kind of meets these criteria are included, and you're not forgetting anyone in terms of the journey along the way from conception through to publication. So I guess ghost authorship and gift authorship, I think, is probably decreasing now. I would hope, with these new guidelines that are in place, that there are things you'll want to avoid. And I think what's really important is to have a paper plan. So if you've got an RCT that you have funded and you want to go ahead and you're going to write the primary paper for that RCT, but there's going to be a lot of other kind of sub-questions that might be asked as part of that. This is a really old paper plan from the Wallop study, if anyone was around in those days. I must update my slides. But Paola and Haley and I sat down last week about brain, and we developed our publication plan. So that people have an expectation of where they'll go in the beginning. And I think that's really important to avoid disappointment and to avoid kind of issues with people thinking, oh, I thought I was going to be first, or whatever, So yeah, it's a good thing to have, but the other thing about it is it also gets you to articulate in your mind and with your team what other sub-questions might come out of that study, nice and early on. Others will come and, along the way, but these might be the primary papers. Okay. Now, let's start on actually writing the paper. What time is it? I'm halfway through. Read the author guidelines. Set targets and word counts. So most journals are around 3,000 for primary data. Some are less, some are a bit more. More and more these days are becoming your paper your way without actually the word limits and things like that apply. So just make sure you work out what each specific journal says. Seek criticism, I say there, because it's constructive feedback, but you want someone to take a really critical lens to your paper, because that's exactly what the reviewers are asked. So if you can kind of get someone else to find any kind of possible kind of reasons for why your paper might be rejected before you submit it, you're going to be one step ahead. So, so if someone's kind of looking at things critically, be grateful and thankful for that, I think. And then I think, none of us are going to submit papers and have 100% acceptance. I don't know anyone. So I think the rejection experience, whilst can be difficult to take, should also be viewed as an important step in terms of improving your paper for your next submission. Who knows who this is? Hands up. Gosh, not many. So I'm a fangirl of Nigella Lawson. Nigella is a celebrity cook on television. She's British. What do we have in common with Nigella? John?
We lick our fingers.
We lick our fingers? Anything else?
What was the recipe?
I think we have a few things in common. She is very clever. We're all very clever.
It's
She's
marketable.
very kind and she's such a lovely person. She is a wonderful writer. So she writes cookbooks. You read her cookbooks, they're beautiful. There are stories embedded throughout her recipes. But most importantly, she follows a recipe. Thank you, Viola. And the point of this slide is to say that writing papers is formulaic. Okay, so we follow a recipe. What are those recipes for writing papers? They're checklists that we use to develop our manuscript. And there's a lot of checklists available on the Equator website. So for a randomized controlled trial, you would use a consort checklist. For an observational study, you would use a strobe checklist. I don't know, does anyone sit down and think, okay, if I do this, this and this, but what order are they in? You go to the strobe checklist, you know exactly the order to place it all in, because it's your recipe for writing that paper. And, systematic reviews, you have your Prisma guidelines, and there's one of these checklists for everything these days. So I think use these recipes to help you write in your paper. Here's just an example of the consort diagram that's been updated since this slide. Here's the strobe. So you can see you need the title, abstract, introduction, background, rationale, objectives, methods. You have your study design, your setting, but it tells you what the recommendations are for each of those things. so you don't forget to put things in. You know, we all forget at some stage, you'll get the order mixed up and things like that. And I still check the order, I still get the order mixed up. Here's our Prisma for systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So make sure you have a look at those. Even qualitative papers will have these checklists for what you need to include. And these are really helpful, I think, in terms of writing papers. Now, I want to refer to this old paper, 2008, which is one of the best papers I've ever read on how to write a paper. And, you know, all these years later, I found this when I was doing my PhD, and I still give it to new students and postdocs, things like that, and there's nods in the audience about how to write a paper. I'm going to use some of the things in this paper in the next section of this, but there are vital components of a paper, and you can see the formulaic recipe type approach to here. So, you know, you go through the checklist and make sure that you actually include all of these things within your paper. But now the creative process, okay? We've got our formulas, we've got our recipes, we know what journal we want to publish in. We've worked all that stuff out, all the easy stuff, yeah? Now we've got to be creative and write the paper. This I find incredibly helpful. It might not work for all of you, but it's exactly what I need to do. And that's splitting the writing from the thinking. So the thinking comes first. And you want to do that by starting to build, say, a flow chart of the main paragraphs. And I'm going to go through each of the different sections of the paper. Give each paragraph a single label. Add the major messages to each of the paragraphs of the flow chart, and then bridge them together for the next paragraph. Collect, print, and read all references. That's not very sustainable. Things have changed since 2008. So you might want to collect and read all the references for each paragraph, and then add them along the flow chart. Adjust your flow chart, and then this finishes most of the thinking. So that again is a fairly formulaic approach to the thinking related to writing. But it really is about getting a scaffold on paper before you actually sit down to write. If I just sit down to write, I'll sit there and I'll stare blankly thinking, I know what to write. But the days, like I'll be walking, often when I walk, I'm like planning a paper in my head. I've even got my little phone out and kind of dictated different paragraphs and things like that on walks, because I find that a creative kind of environment to help me think. But then sit down, so you've got this kind of framework, like building a house, you know, you have your scaffolds and your framework before you go and kind of put the walls in and stuff like that. So your thinking is building your framework and your scaffolding and things like that around your paper. And then start the writing. And once you've done that, you'll find that you can concentrate on the language and the writing of the paper paragraph by paragraph. And, you know, if you're a writer that feels like you need a block of time to write a paper, you know, you've got a spare hour, but you think, oh, that's not long enough to get started. This approach is very helpful for those people, because if you're writing paragraph by paragraph, you can actually get, you know, a paragraph here, and it doesn't matter if you haven't finished your paper, but you've kind of focused on that paragraph. And this is why Shut Up and Write works really well. So Shut Up and Write is a little session for those that don't know, where you just sit down, 45 minutes, you do nothing but write. and then you walk away and you do your next job. But that snap writing allows you to kind of do this piece by piece and then bring the whole paper together. And if you've kind of thought about your framework, it will be very easy in terms of then focusing on your paragraphs. So it progresses quickly. And the other thing that we recommend in Shut Up and Write is that you don't worry about inserting your references and things like that. You don't worry so much about, is this a perfect paragraph? You just write. Later you can come back and insert the references, but you don't want to interrupt the thought processes as you're getting things down. Another thing I do in terms of writing is I'll sit with a notepad and I write a lot of the paper in a notepad. And it's not a paper that I would present to anyone, or it's not writing I would present to anyone, but it allows that stream of thought onto the page, and then I can fix it. And I find that really helpful. Others might prefer the computer. It's personal choice and whatever works for you. I like this. This is right from the you know, how to write a paper. But one evening later, part of the paper's finished. And you can confidently start the next section. So in this paper, they have these flow diagrams for each of the different sections of the paper. This is the introduction. So how do you write an introduction? What I love about this is it actually tells you what the paragraph should be. So, you know, your general background about the disease, starting like this and working down into a V. So that you're big picture up here, and then you get specific. So the general background, the specific dilemma, what's the problem that we want to address with this paper? Why is it still unresolved? Well, you know, what's the problem, and what's the problem with the solution perhaps? Well, my idea resolve it. So you need to then sell this as the answer, and then present your hypotheses and aims. And that's your introduction done. Bang, bingo. Then we have methods. So probably, who finds the methods the easiest part? And why is that? Because this section is so formulated. You know, you've already written the methods before you actually do the study. So this is easy. You include your design here. And again, this follows those checklists for each of the different study designs. So the consort, the strobe, the prisma. Methods are the most formulaic part of that recipe. And then we have the result. So you've got a primary research question that you're writing this paper for. So your first paragraph is going to be your description of your population. But the next paragraph is going to answer your main question. Answer those aims, answer those hypotheses. If you've got two questions, put your first one in the first paragraph, the second one in the next, and then follow with any secondary questions that you've had. And then finally, there might be some unexpected hypothesis generating results that you found. So they might go, but they're not the most important thing, of course. The main question is, even if it's a negative study, you still have to focus on your primary hypothesis and aims. Who finds the discussion the most difficult? A lot of people do. And here is the guide for this. I do this slightly differently, and that's the way I was taught. But the first paragraph, this is really important. The first paragraph of your discussion, you write your bottom line, okay? What this study was about and what the implications are. You don't kind of put all your results in this first paragraph. bottom line, it's kind of big picture stuff. And then for each paragraph that continues, you then, like your results, take your main question and discuss it. Within that discussion, what have other people done? What is this new? What have you brought that's new to this? And then you do your next lot of results, compare what your results found, compare and contrast to the current literature, what your implications are. And do that for each of your results paragraphs. And then you want to do, okay, so of course we have some limitations of this study, some strengths and weaknesses. So then you want to kind of include those. And try and think broadly. I remember my first PhD paper, I presented to my supervisors. I had no limitations. And my supervisor said to me, "Oh, you know, you need a limitation section." And I was like, "Oh, there won't be." So no matter how hard they might be to think of, there's going to be some there. And if you don't put them in, you're going to give the reviewer a reason to reject you. I think a critical interpretation is also important. Now, so, you know, what does this mean? What's the so what about? And then, of course, your conclusions. And if you follow that structure, this one's slightly different in a way. What I did want to do was replace it with mine before this talk, but I didn't. So next time. But yeah, if you follow that process, your paper's written. And, you know, I think the other thing about doing writing your paper is ensuring that it's easy for the reviewer, easy for the editor, easy for the reviewer. So what matters there? Attention to detail. You send in your manuscript and your cover letter and it's full of typos, and it irritates. Little things that you might not think about, ensure your decimal place is consistent in your manuscript, and that everything that has a decimal place is the same throughout that manuscript. Consistency in your writing in terms of American and UK. You know, your apostrophes, as people know. Having nice tables, not too full that you just get lost when you look at it. Like, ensure your tables have the right amount of data within it so that, you know, they're interpreted. Figures, ensure your figures are clear and crisp and, you know, and that there's no inconsistency between what you're saying in the table and what you're saying in the figures and things like that. And your references. Make sure your references are balanced, that, you know, you're not missing critical papers, because if you're writing a paper in a certain area, chances are an expert is going to be reviewing your paper who has written on this topic. So, you know, they're going to be looking, oh, they didn't cite my last paper here. Again, give a reviewer a chance to reject, an opportunity to reject, or to come back to you and tell you to include it. All right. So this is not in the paper, but this is kind of just a little thing that I put together when I started thinking about this. Whereas, you know, I was writing little bullet points here next to each of the different flow diagrams for each individual paper that I was writing. You know, when they talked about writing the framework, so just putting in the things like that there, so I could think about putting that together. And here's an example of that. Well, you can see what paper it is, the multidimensional assessment of older people. 2008, I was targeting ERJ. So this is the one that got rejected. I presented it at the symposium the other day and said it got rejected. over and over by the respiratory audience and ended up in the aging journal. All right, so of course that's pretty simple. But once you've done all that, then submit it. What happens is it's reviewed. Hair loss. Thanks, Kathy. It's reviewed by different journals will have different staging, like with respirology, for example, it first comes to a deputy editor. Deputy editor makes a decision, reject, or send to the editor-in-chief. So then it goes to the editor-in-chief and they work out whether or not, yes, no, they agree. And then it goes to the associate editors, who then ask the reviewers to review the paper, comes back to the associate editor who makes a decision, yes, no. Then it goes back to the senior editor who then makes a final decision. So you can see there's a lot of steps, and that's sometimes why papers take so long. Particularly, I would say that since COVID, it's been much more difficult to get people reviewing the papers than it was pre-COVID. Yeah, anyway, so that's the next thing. And at that stage, after all that, the reviewers will review it. You'll find out what they think of it. They'll ask you to either resubmit it or they'll reject it, or in some cases they might accept it. I think, you know, if you've ever had one submitted outright, it's usually an opinion piece or something like that. And then finally, after maybe sometimes many iterations, like that paper I gave the example of, you get an accept. And I think as researchers, just a final word, there's a lot of rejection. And that can kind of impact how you feel about kind of going forward after you've been rejected after rejection after rejection. And I think what's most important is remaining resilient, not giving up. And, you know, just keep on trying. That paper that was rejected 5 times, you know, working that in 2011, now the focus of the 2025 symposium might that's the COPD overlay. So might just be that you're ahead of the game. Okay, I will take questions, and I think there's a few things in the chat.